We've got a very special episode tonight. This is a little bit unusual for a Saturday. I have been trying to take Saturdays off, but we've got a special set of circumstances, and we're just bringing everything together right now. My guest tonight is David Hawkins, of course. And David, I'm just getting you the screen share because we're going to be dealing with quite a lot of information. I want to make sure you can see everything we're going to be discussing here. It was December 15th of 2017 that Barry and Honey Sherman were discovered dead in their home. And it was initially ruled a murder-suicide, but in a bizarre twist, Toronto police have decided that it was in fact a double homicide. David, tonight you're going to be applying your well-known technique of reverse engineering crime scenes, and I know you've prepared quite a lot of very interesting information for us. What have you got for us tonight?
Yeah, this is a fascinating double murder, and it happened in December of last year at the Toronto home of Barry and Honey Sherman, Barry being the chief executive officer of a major generic drug pharmaceutical company called Apotex. And he was in the habit of suing big pharmaceutical companies to get them to, or trying to overthrow their patents, because he figured with his generic drugs he could come in and supply drugs to the marketplace at a much cheaper cost. So he actually had a lot of enemies, and I believe in passing he'd said he'd wonder why he hadn't been bumped off before.
Yeah.
But anyway, what intriguing about this is it appears to be a classic example of what a man-in-the-middle attack is. Now, maybe some of your listeners don't know this term. I'm relatively familiar with it, having looked at some of the classical man-in-the-middle attacks that date back, in the case of England, prior to the union with Scotland, to the decapitation of Mary, Queen of Scots. And Queen Elizabeth I's spy master, Sir Francis Walsingham, decided that with Mary, Queen of Scots' ties to the papacy, she needed to be eliminated. Anyway, she was incarcerated and evidently in the habit of smuggling out messages to her French and Spanish allies, both being Catholic at that time, with a note in the bung of or the cork of a barrel. I don't know whether it's a barrel of wine or barrel of beer or whatever that lady at the time was drinking, and with her courtiers, right? Mm-hmm. So Sir Francis Walsingham had quite a skillful forger in his employ, and so they intercepted the barrel with the bung with the note inside and added a postscript that made it look as though Mary was plotting to have her half-sister, Queen Elizabeth, assassinated. So this was a trumped-up charge, but it resulted in Mary, Queen of Scots, being taken out of her prison and brought to the Tower of London, ultimately to be executed. So when we think about when Napoleon said perfidious Albion, basically saying that the English are a bunch of sharks and that sort of thing, yeah. He didn't exactly hit the nail on the head, but there were certainly some elements of a very successful imperial foreign policy followed by England that allowed it ultimately to dominate a third or a half of the globe, on which the sun never sat. But man-in-the-middle attacks was a very strong part of British foreign policy when a foreign enemy needed to be divided against itself, if you see what I mean.
Right.
So now the United States, or at least at the time of the colonies, was a classic opportunity for the English or the British to put in some man-in-the-middle attacks that would have Americans, the colonists, fighting each other. And they were particularly successful in the Civil War. Were you aware that the Lee Enfield rifle factory in the United Kingdom near London supplied 50,000 Lee Enfield rifles to both sides of the Civil War for the first 3 years, 50,000 each side. That represents a lot of dead colonists, I guess. Anyway, back to the particular case of the Barry Sherman and Honey Sherman. It appears that there was a man in the middle attack. Now, you know that I've developed this technique that I think will one day be very successful. Instead of going after suspected perpetrators of murder one, you go after them if you can demonstrate on a balance of probability argument that someone or some people have died a wrongful death as a result of the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices in their custody. And the beauty of that is, as I say, it's a balance of probability argument. So in the case of the Shermans, we would be, I think, you and I, with our audience, going through the process that resulted in the death of Barry and Honey Sherman, and see if we have a balance of probability argument that they died as a result of the wrongful death as a result of the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of patented devices. And if subsequently we have additional evidence to prove murder one, well, the individuals who would be chased through the courts for civil damages, a bit like O.J. Simpson, ultimately might end up on, well, in the worst case, death row. Over to you.
Well, let's go through a couple things, David. That was quite a lot of information. And before we get too into it, yeah, there you go. It's better to have you on camera there. I want to remind everyone that this is a fully public episode. David and I are doing a show every Friday. Normally, it's around 1 p.m. Eastern, and that can be seen only on Patreon. So people should go over to patreon.com/reverse CSI storyboards or patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. You can enjoy exclusive content over there. And every week, David and I are doing shows where we delve into his technique of reverse engineering these crime scenes based on a technological signature or a pattern in practice. Isn't that right, David?
Yes, and in the particular case of Barry and Honey Sherman, what particularly intrigues me is an apparent man-in-the-middle attack on the Toronto police communication systems. Over to you.
Right. Well, there's a couple bits of background I think that we should go over before we get into the specific man-in-the-middle attack, because I do think the Toronto police are definitely an important part of this and need some scrutiny here. Barry Sherman, as you pointed out, was an extremely litigious individual. His company, Apotex, was a generic pharmaceutical company, and to say that he was in the regular practice of suing his competitors seems to be an understatement based on all the reporting that I've seen in preparation for our talk about this. He's basically famous for suing people. Not just competitors in the pharmaceutical industry, but there was a lawsuit with his cousins. They alleged that he had essentially stolen the pharmaceutical business from his own uncle, the father of the cousins. The cousin took a polygraph test with regard to the murder. The cousin alleged that Barry had actually asked the cousin to hire someone to kill Honey several years before this occurred, and he basically used this allegation as sort of a pretext for presuming that Barry might have, in fact, killed his own wife and then committed suicide. But David, there's quite a bit of evidence at the crime scene that would seem to make this type of murder-suicide impossible, right? Both of their hands were bound, weren't they?
Yeah, they were bound at the wrists. There was an indication of using plastic sort of, I don't know, handcuffs is the right word, the kind that you might use to subdue a prisoner in a jail. So it appears that Holly Sherman came home first. Barry Sherman was at the office, where he would often work quite late. So when Holly Sherman came into the home, it appears that she was jumped. Her jacket, if that's the right garment, was sort of pulled back, so her elbows were behind her back, and her wrists were bound either most probably with a plastic restrainer, one of those perhaps zip locks or
Yeah, zip
quick tie
ties.
type things, right?
Right.
So now where she was at the particular moment when her husband arrived, I don't know. She may have been told to stand at the door and welcome him with her hands behind her back. Anyway, unsuspecting, he walks in and presumably he's jumped as well by the SWAT team or the Con Air SWAT team or whoever's got inside the house to carry out the dirty deed, if you will. Then at some time they were both taken into the vicinity of their indoor swimming pool, and this is where it really gets hideous in my mind. They were both had belts put around their necks, and the belts were tied to the railing of the indoor swimming pool, and they were put in a sort of half-seated, half-standing position with their legs in front of them, so they couldn't actually take their body weight. So they would have choked slowly to death on the belts, right? And presumably, in order to prevent them sort of helping getting themselves free, their wrists would have continued to be tied behind their backs with these plastic restrainers.
Right.
Now, I can imagine, well, it's hard for me to imagine the horror in the minds of the husband or the wife, knowing that beside them was their spouse and they were choking to death at a rate really determined by the psychopaths who'd rigged up this configuration of belt around their neck and arms tied behind the back. Now, presumably they died in the night, and they were found by the estate agent who was responsible for selling the house
Right.
the following morning. And obviously an all stations alert, I guess, and the Toronto police show up. Now, I don't know what state the bodies were left in by the people who hung them on the bridge. My guess is that the Toronto police who showed up would have had absolutely no doubt that these two were the victims of a double homicide, unless they had dressed the crime scene in a manner that concealed that evidence. Anyway, the first announcement almost immediately after the bodies were discovered by the Toronto police was it was a murder-suicide and no one need worry anything. So days and weeks passed by before the family decided that this was garbage, and they hired some private detectives, or private investigators, who I think they had a second autopsy. And again, it's mind-boggling, but they noticed the marks on the wrist, and they started to assemble the crime scene together. And eventually, I think several weeks after the bodies had been discovered, the Toronto police admitted it was a double homicide.
I believe it was 4 months later.
I'm sorry?
I believe it was 4 months later, and I think I'm sorry to interrupt you, David, but I think it's worth going over some more of these details, because it does seem like there were quite a lot of people who may have had motivation to want to kill Barry Sherman, certainly, at least, if not both Barry and Honey. You spoke about the fact that their house was for sale. The house went up for sale, I think, about a month before they were killed. And I also, in my research for this segment, found that in addition to all of the litigating that Barry Sherman was doing against his competitors in the pharmaceutical industry, he actually sued the person who constructed the house and got about $2 million back. So by all measures, he seems like a guy who is in the regular practice of suing basically everybody. And, you know, we can draw some conclusions from that. I think a lot of people who get into this practice of, you know, suing people, it's essentially lawfare. It's a term that we've become very familiar with and have actually started a show about. Lawfare is using the law as a method of warfare. So I think Barry Sherman realized, he even wrote in his own memoirs about the first time he got involved in litigation. Someone in the Canadian government had made a ruling that he didn't like relative to his pharmaceutical company. I think they removed them as a vendor or or something like that. So Barry Sherman sued the employee at the government agency that had made this ruling, and the ruling was immediately overturned. So I get the feeling that Barry Sherman was the type of guy that liked to sue people to try to force them to do something, because he's a very wealthy guy. He can initiate lawsuits without too much problem, and I think most people become very intimidated when there is a lawsuit, and there is a tendency for them to back off. Now, in the case of a major pharmaceutical company like Pfizer or Wyeth or any of these ones that he might be competing against, if he brings a lawsuit, a pharmaceutical company is going to do a big evaluation of how much it would cost to actually defend the suit versus settling, or perhaps licensing some patents to allow his generic pharmaceutical company to make those drugs. So it's a very interesting thing, the litigation that Barry Sherman was frequently involved in, and certainly any of the pharmaceutical competitors that might be losing billions of dollars could be motivated to do that. We don't certainly mean to implicate anyone, but we're talking about billions of dollars that this guy is a thorn in the side over. It certainly would be a motive to at least look at. The cousin also, who is suing him, says he hates him and feels that Barry has stolen his birthright, and even admitted in a television interview that he wanted Barry dead but had nothing to do with the murder. Very, very strange testimony from the cousin, who actually failed a polygraph test. So I don't know what we think of that, but there are all these angles. I want to play, David, very quickly, a video of a detective from the Toronto police speaking about this right after, as you said, right after the murder. Let's just take a look at that for a second. Oh, sorry, let me get the volume on here.
Are not currently
so this is a
looking
detective
for an outstanding suspect seeking.
Let's take it back here.
Though it is very early.
This is Detective Brandon Price.
Murder.
I can say that at this point in the investigation, though it is very early, we are not currently seeking or looking for an outstanding suspect.
After autopsies were performed
Sorry about
on
that.
December 16th,
So he basically
police said the
is
couple
just
died
saying
from
that
ligature neck compression. Homicide detective.
The detective said that it's early in the investigation. I'm sorry that you didn't hear that. I'll have to look into why that happened. It's early in the investigation, but they're not looking at anybody. They basically think it's not a homicide, is what he said. And he was sort of stammering. Yeah, I know why you couldn't hear it. I'm sorry. I'll have to address that. He was stuttering, he was stammering, he was uneasy in his speech, and I have a lot of questions about the police there in Toronto, primarily because of one member of the police force that you and I were speaking about a bit earlier. Do we want to talk about him just yet?
Well, he's connected. This is the one connected with Frank D'Angelo, who had secured $100 million of finance from Barry Sherman. Frank D'Angelo, I don't know if polymath is the right word, but I think he ran a brewery, a self-promotion agency, and he made horror flicks. So that's an interesting combination for anyone to lend $100 million to. So again, whether in that a matrix of situations as a motive for Frank D'Angelo, but I don't think we need to go there. But other than to point out that Frank D'Angelo was accused of assaulting, a sexual assault of a young woman who was the daughter of one of his business associates, and it went to trial, and he was released, although the judge apparently said there was merit in the case put together by the young woman who'd been assaulted and Frank D'Angelo. So Frank D'Angelo then holds a celebration at some upmarket venue, which I think he might have owned, and one of the cops showed up, and he was recorded by the Ontario Provincial Police, and subsequently was charged with obstruction of justice. So there's connections, there's a huge number of fascinating connections between the Ontario Police, the Toronto Police, this body that I'll talk about in a minute, this Treaty 3 Police,
Yeah.
and the guy who makes horror flicks. And I imagine that one script for a horror flick might describe exactly what happened to the Honey and Barry Sherman. Over to you.
Well, I can't say that I've seen any of the horror films, but I think it is important that we speak about some of these different people that you're talking about. Frank D'Angelo is a sort of a B-movie Hollywood kind of guy. He's a director, he's an actor, he's a singer, and he's directed films like this one, Sicilian Vampire. And there's some very strange things about this Frank D'Angelo guy because, you know, I think if Quinn Michaels were with us, he would describe this logo here for the Sicilian Vampire possibly as a sigil. It's two snakes intertwined behind Frank D'Angelo's own face. There are some wings. The serpent's tails seem to form the horns of Baphomet, and we've got these three black legs surrounding him. The interesting thing about this film, Sicilian Vampire, it's a decidedly crappy film, but it has some really surprisingly big name actors in it. Armand Assante, Daniel Baldwin, James Caan. Here we see Frank D'Angelo, Robert Davi. He's been in James Bond films. Daryl Hannah, she's a well-known actress. It's quite surprising to me for such a, you know, Robert Loggia. He's done films here. Eric Roberts is Julia Roberts' cousin. Paul Sorvino was in Goodfellas. He seems to be quite connected to a number of well-known actors and actors that have appeared in a number of mafia-related films. Paul Sorvino played Paulie in Goodfellas, and of course James Caan is an Academy Award-winning actor. He played Sonny in The Godfather. And at very least, there seems to be a fascination with mafia culture on the part of Mr. D'Angelo. The thing that I find so strange is, you know, I've known quite a lot of people like this in Hollywood, you know, Hollywood hustlers, guys who are doing their best to make movies. Frequently actors get into directing, and Frank D'Angelo was also a singer. I've located his YouTube channel. He's got quite a lot of music videos on there. He also signed a deal. He got a record contract with Red. Now, I was unaware of Red prior to tonight, but Red is apparently a division of Sony Music. And again, this causes me to think of Quinn Michaels. I haven't done any work with Quinn in quite a while, but he was always fascinated with the RedNet. And so we see Red Music. That's interesting. You've pointed out to me that Frank D'Angelo would shoot his films using Red cameras. Now, I've owned Red cameras. I've shot movies with Red cameras. The Red Digital Cinema Company is one of the most popular for shooting motion pictures. Their cameras are among the highest resolution available. So I don't think that is on its own of particular interest, but the fact that they made a point of mentioning this Red camera in this Vanity Fair article about Mr. D'Angelo. It speaks specifically about his film, The Sicilian Vampire. It asks the question, how did an Oscar-nominated legend end up in this painfully amateurish horror film? And it's an excellent question. I would augment their question by saying, why is Vanity Fair writing about it? I mean, David, this is, you know, I've worked on films of the caliber of Sicilian Vampire, very low budget films, and they never get written about in Vanity Fair. They never have an actor like James Caan associated with them, and certainly if they did have someone like James Caan or Paul Sorvino or Daryl Hannah, you'd have only that one actor, maybe for one day. So there are a lot of very strange things about this film, about Frank D'Angelo. And as you pointed out, Frank was also the CEO of a brewery which was owned by here's another picture of Mr. D'Angelo. The brewery was called, I have it here somewhere, Steel something Brewery, and it was owned by Sherman. It was an old factory that had a brewery in it, and so Frank D'Angelo took it over with the plan to revitalize the brewery and sell off the components that they didn't need, but he ran up the debt of the company to $100 million, and then Sherman's son, Jonathan, took it over. I'm curious to know more about that because, David, it sounds very much to me like the plan executed in the film Goodfellas, where the mafiosos take over a restaurant, run up the credit, and then when the creditors come around, the mafiosos leave, and the restaurant owner is left holding the bag. So that seems like something that might have been happening. I don't know how this guy Frank D'Angelo has time to make movies, record albums, be the CEO of a brewery, be friends with corrupt police officers, and shake all of these charges that are brought against him. It seems like a very twisted tale, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And buried in his contacts, or his community of contacts, would be presumably actors who could participate in horror flicks, or script writers who could develop a script for a horror flick. And I'm thinking that essentially the way in which the staging of the murders of Barry and Honey Sherman was set up, it looks to me, not being an expert, as though someone had scripted these murders, deployed the actors and actresses and script writers and people to go in and clean up the evidence, and end up with, well, a double homicide, the removal of a guy who had launched hundreds of lawsuits against Big Pharma that in some cases costed them billions of dollars. And that actually reminds me of Jerome Lemelson, because he'd do submarine patents. I think he had 605 patents on his books when he died, and he would file the patent but not have it published, wait until Sony came up with something that their research lab had produced and applied for a patent, and then point out to Sony it had already been patented. And so he'd extort Sony for protection money so that they could actually produce what they had developed. I believe these are known as NPEs, non-producing enterprises. That is, they're trolling around looking at patents that are being arranged by someone else, and then suing them. It's classic patent troll.
Now, David, are we aware of any direct connection between Barry Sherman and Jerome Lemelson? Because they both seem like very litigious individuals who, although they are involved in highly technical, sophisticated businesses, it seems like a major part of both of their business plans was essentially doing lawfare against their competitors.
Right. So I think, no, we don't have direct evidence, but since Lemelson's MO was to file submarine patents, and Barry Sherman's was to file lawsuits against people for the patents, I would be amazed if there was not a connection or a back channel where Sherman Enterprises and Lemelson Enterprises would arrange basically to operate, well, dare I call it an extortion racket, which would give a lot of reason for people to have him whacked.
Yeah, I wonder, Lemelson Center.
Oh, and incidentally, I was going to ask you, you know that logo you showed for the Sicilian vampire?
Yeah.
You know what I read a book, I think I was 14 years old, and there was some book that came into my possession from a garage sale in England called The Migration of Symbols. And it was fascinating, about how the swastika moves through different cultures, retains some elements of its old meaning and some elements of the new. You know, when you put that logo up, what it reminded me of?
Tell me.
Well, associated with a young 7-year-old boy in Jakarta.
Oh, yes. That's right.
Not identical, but it's got that enigmatic feel of, limbs loosely connected to bodies, a disconnectedness about it. Anyway, and of course I'm talking about Barack Hussein Obama, who at that age of 7 years old was in the care of a cross-dressing male prostitute who was hired as his nanny by Anne Dunham, who was a communist. Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's not a million miles away, I think, that emblem. And it's consistent with the theory that it's not unique to me, that England developed this pedophile entrapment and blackmail ring very early on in its drive for global dominance. And in the particular case of the 20th century, you have a guy who probably for 50 years was abusing children and using them apparently to entrap senior people in the royal family and the British government, and his name is Jimmy Savile.
Right. You know, David, the other thing I found kind of interesting is that the brief description of Sicilian Vampire talks about reputed mobster Sonny Trafficante, who I guess is a character in the film. But of course, Carlos Trafficante was a pivotal figure in the assassination of JFK. Interesting.
Yeah. Oh, what is it? Something web we weave when we first practice to deceive. Oh, what a tangled web we weave. And so the fascinating thing about the Federal Bridge, if I may come back to that, maybe you could just pop it in.
Sure.
And I could talk about this idea of the man in the middle attack. You'll see we have the Federal Bridge, as in the 2013 version that you discovered several episodes ago, and then at 9 o'clock, as far as the Federal Bridge Certification Authority hub on that drawing, you've got those three entities that I believe are absolutely core to the attack of 9/11, and these bizarre kind of sexualized killings where little John Benet Ramsey is killed with a level of gratuitous cruelty that perhaps matches to some extent what we saw with the Shermans and what we saw with Gareth Williams. So you have the state of Illinois, the Department of Justice and Veterans Affairs, and Department of Justice in 1994, they produced an extraordinary organization called DOJ Pride. I'm quite sure that Field McConnell's sister, Christine Marcy, was the prime mover behind that. And that represents the LGBTQ, Q standing for queer, community in the ATF, the FBI, Bureau of Prisons, United States Marshal Service, Office of Justice Programs, etc., etc. And as far as I can see, that sexualized crime scene investigation. Now, ATF, just as an example, its full name, I believe, is ATFE, Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosive. And of course, they had an office in the Murrah building.
Yeah.
Now, when that was blown up, these animals actually put bombs underneath the daycare center. So what we're talking about is angry psychopaths who delight in causing intense pain and agony to their victims, have a fundamental contempt. Now, I'm not saying every member of DOJ Pride has that contempt, but let's say they have a deviant lifestyle, and if you could remove the value judgment association with deviant and just look at it as a sort of Gaussian distribution, where they don't put the same kind of value as in a heterosexual family with children as the great majority of the population. So now, if you want to launch a man in the middle attack, as I believe was done over the Federal Bridge, you'd want to be able to recruit through a community that was on the edge of psychosis. Maybe that's the wrong word, but I can see the First Nations reserves, the prison system, and returning vets who've been traumatized in an act of war as an extraordinarily rich community to recruit psychopaths and go and make a horror flick or a snuff film reel with the Shermans and send a message to anyone else in the generic drug industry who might want to take on Big Pharma and overthrow their patents, which represent billions of dollars of income. Over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it just seems like the more we look into this, the more there are a number of groups or individuals who, you know, we're always looking for motive, means, and opportunity, right? So we've got...
Well, motive, opportunity, and weapon. And what I'd say is let's reverse that. let's see if we can identify the weapon. That's the essence of reverse engineering, and see if there is a weapon or a patented device that carries inherently the signature of what we find at the crime scene. Over to you.
Is there?
Totally. There's this Entrust system for public key infrastructure. Now, just to remind the audience, public key infrastructure was invented at GCHQ in the late 60s and early 70s. It was only sort of made public, I believe, in the 1990s. But from a very early period, it's believed that GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, and the National Security Agency were working together on implementing this. Now, Federal Bridge Certification Authority grew out of Entrust public key infrastructure, but the company that implemented it in the early 1990s is a company I've mentioned before called McDonnell Detweiler and Associates of Richmond, British Columbia. And what they were doing, they put a team together to travel around the world and show countries like Australia or the Five Eyes countries how to implement Entrust public key. And you can see actually, I think several elements of Entrust, like Entrust NFI root. The root key basically gives the custody of the root power to implement a Federal Bridge man-in-the-middle attack by pretending to be, or pretending to contact, or pretending to link a couple of operators with malice aforethought, if you will. So McDonnell Detweiler Associates in 1997, it was given an outsourcing contract by the British Columbia government to implement or act as the prime contractor for an organization called ECOM, Emergency Communications, in Vancouver. Now, ECOM provides a number of services to participating municipalities and the RCMP, and it's described very interestingly as a private corporation with public shareholders, like the RCMP. One of the services of ECOM is criminal background testing and the retrieval of police reports online. What that would give you is, if you wanted to assemble a bunch of criminals to go and make a snuff film at the pig farm, you can find out who's in jail and would like to be on furlough for 48 hours, who's out there that has a record of abusing women, maybe even shooting them with biological bullets, because 6 of the victims at the pig farm, their bodies were found to have bullets in them. So every Friday night from 1996 to 2001 or 2, or most Friday nights, there would be up to 2,000 people coming to a rave at the pig farm and apparently watching a woman being tortured to death in front of the cameras. Now, this is disgusting and horrible, etc., etc. I think we have to move beyond disgust and horror, because essentially that ECOM software implemented by McDonnell Detweiler, if it was implemented on the Federal Bridge used by the Toronto Police or the Treaty 3 native organization, you got the opportunity for a man-in-the-middle attack on the Toronto Police and the insertion of fake news that would have told maybe the embarrassed guy that you showed briefly, we couldn't hear the sound, maybe that was why he was looking nervous, because he knew that the Shermans had been found with their wrists bound behind their back.
Right.
But someone, and he didn't know who, had injected into the media or the Toronto Police communication system, this was a murder-suicide, don't worry folks, the door wasn't broken in, da-da-da-da-da, and hours, if not days and weeks, were lost, instead of going after the killers, who were maybe back in jail with a nearly perfect alibi.
So, of course, David, you're speaking about the ongoing theory that you've built that Christine Marcy's JPATS SWAT team, the Con Air SWAT team, can be used and sent around the country to conduct these type of murders.
Sent around the world, because she was flying people to rendition centers, where Gina Haspel, the current CIA director, would have them waterboarded and tortured. And Gina Haspel, as you remember, she's been deployed by President Trump to go to Istanbul and look over the case of the torture killing of Jamal Khashoggi. I mean, it's absurd beyond belief.
Well, let's talk a bit about the connections that Apotex had that might have been of interest to someone like Christine Marcy. There was a very pronounced connection between Apotex and the Clinton Foundation. And this was something that a lot of people caught on to right away. Of course, the Clinton Foundation is well known for their work in providing pharmaceuticals to a variety of different areas. This is an article from the Clinton Foundation's website talking about a 76-ton airlift of medicine and medical supplies that landed in Puerto Rico. Now, I would remind everyone that the Clinton Foundation has, according to Charles Ortel, and all of his research is based on government documents and documents from the Clinton Foundation itself, the foundation has never been legally properly organized. Its only purpose, its only legal purpose, is the creation of a presidential library in Arkansas, and all of the work that it has done in disaster relief and distributing pharmaceuticals around the world, irrespective of how we feel about it being nice or not, is illegal. It does not have legal authorization to collect money as charity and then use that money to buy pharmaceutical products. We also know that the Clinton Foundation got into a lot of trouble. Well, I should say one of their pharmaceutical partners got into a lot of trouble. I'm talking about, of course, the generic pharmaceutical company Ranbaxy in India got into trouble because they were sending a lot of money to the Clinton Foundation, and then the Clinton Foundation was utilizing Ranbaxy drugs in Africa and Haiti and other areas to basically, alleviate HIV, but those drugs were never tested and the efficacy of those drugs was unknown. So they could have actually been harming people, and it's not exactly clear to me at this moment what the connection between Apotex and the Clinton Foundation was, but there seems to be a lot of stuff going on with these foundations.
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And then back to Christine Marcy, she's credited with launching a prisoner medical services program during her career, presumably when she was senior counsel for the detention and deportation program of the Immigration and Naturalization Service. Well, one of the drugs that I did a little bit of research on is, I think if I've got the pronunciation right, lysergic acid amide, which I guess is some derivative or something connected with LSD. But lysergic acid amide, the patent was taken out by Eli Lilly in 1956. And going through the blurb associated with that patent, there's this sinister phrase that these formulations are useful from a psychotherapy research point of view because they elicit characteristic patterns of rage and hallucination. So I think if you're a prisoner in the Christine Marcy regime, where you can be administered drugs that elicit characteristic patterns of rage and hallucinations, you would be extremely useful if it was decided that you were to be flown to some place like Istanbul on a Conair plane or a Conair leased plane to participate in the contract killing of Jamal Khashoggi and the planting of evidence, which would include having a body double dressed in his clothes, go out the back door. This I think is very important from what I'm hoping to achieve with this technique that we are almost refining on the fly, yourself and myself, Jason, is the idea of spoliation of evidence. Because if we confine our assertions to the balance of probability argument that someone, in this case the Shermans, has suffered a wrongful death as a result of the negligent, reckless, willful or fraudulent use of patented devices, and one of those patented devices proved to be the injection of the fake news through a man in the middle of the attack, then what we're really doing is encouraging, for example, the family of the Shermans to launch a class action suit representing the family for the wrongful death of Barry and Honey. which is a balanced probability one. The beauty of that argument is, whilst you and I are struggling to determine who did what and when, you get the rights to discovery. That is, say, Frank D'Angelo and his cronies in, I don't know, the mafia or Hollywood, or including James Caan, can be quizzed. Well, why were you participating in this horror flick? And were any of the scriptwriters or actors used to make a horror flick with the Shermans, except that it went real, and maybe broadcast or transmit the images over the Federal Bridge to scare the hell out of other generic drug manufacturers and say, look, don't mess with us, we big pharma, because we'll come and get you.
It's certainly a possibility. I'm intrigued by some of these relationships, and particularly the relationship between Frank D'Angelo and this guy right here, Mike Ritigliano. Is that his name? Now, you brought
Yes.
Mike Ritigliano to my attention. What initially caused you to do that?
Well, Mike Ritigliano, I think he was part of that celebration put on by Frank D'Angelo after the charge of sexual assault was dismissed.
Right.
So Frank D'Angelo then puts on a party and invites a couple of Crown counsels or Crown attorneys, one of the cops that was investigating it, and this Ratigliano guy. And subsequently, the Ontario police are actually running surveillance on that party, and the cop is charged with obstruction of justice.
Ritigliano is.
So you've got a network of, it would appear, corrupt cops and insiders of this Frank D'Angelo relationship with Barry Sherman. And in order to hide corruption on that scale, where people are getting killed and hundreds of millions of dollars is going from left to right or right to left, you need a very elaborate network where communications can take place securely over insecure networks, and there you're back to the Federal Bridge.
Well, so conceivably, it's the Toronto police or the Ontario provincial police or both that would have access to that Federal Bridge. Is there a way for us to, from that chart, determine if that's true?
Well, first of all, that chart doesn't show all the connections. So, for example, the 2001 incarnation that had two banks who's been removed.
Right.
So I think there are thousands of connections now with the Federal Bridge Certification Authority, allowing the opportunity for man-in-the-middle attacks on a whole range of countries and agencies, including the Ontario Police. The point is, the Ontario Police, the Toronto Police, and the Treaty 3 Police, maybe you could show the logo of the Treaty 3 Police, they're all now using public key infrastructure, Entrust public key infrastructure to communicate. And the argument is, in many cases, some of the poorest areas of the country, the most deprived, the most addicted to alcohol and drugs and child abuse, are the First Nations around Canada, and I don't know if the same applies in the United States. Obviously, in the prison systems and the returning vets, you've got people who, many of them, are on the edge of mental breakdown or whatever, and extremely, I would think, straightforward to recruit for the kind of things that turned Frank D'Angelo's crank with his horror flicks. Over to you.
So, David, talk to us for a minute about the Treaty 3. The Treaty 3 Police and the Treaty 3. I've never heard of that before tonight. What is the Treaty 3 and what are the Treaty 3 Police? Well,
to be honest, it's a bit embarrassing. I'd never heard of them until this morning. When I heard about the frustration of the family in terms of finding out who killed Barry and Honey Sherman, and then I thought, well, can I see if there's any connection between an organization that could hack into the Federal Bridge and generate a man-in-the-middle attack on the Toronto police, where they announced it was a murder-suicide just after the body had been found with all of the evidence that it wasn't a murder-suicide, it was a double murder. So I Googled for Entrust, public key infrastructure, etc., and up popped, in the Ontario case, the Treaty 3 police. So I looked at that, and apparently in the Victorian era, the government of Canada struck a series of treaties with First Nations. So Treaty 1, Treaty 2, Treaty 3, and then I think Treaty 4 right through to Treaty 8, which governed relationships between First Nations and the government of Canada, and presumably the government of Ontario, the provincial government of Ontario. But apparently the Treaty 3 one was something of a watershed, and elements of Treaty 3 were incorporated into Treaty 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and back engineered, or reverse engineered, if you will, into Treaty 1 and 2. And then they created a Treaty 3 police service, which serves the people and communities of the Treaty 3 area, which is an area that's got a big chunk of Ontario, which was presumably the subject of the treaty in the first place. So now what that means is, and I'm not casting aspersions on the Treaty 3 police, but you have a native or First Nations police force connected to all the kinds of problems that they have on those First Nations territories of alcoholism and abuse and unemployment and child lack of education, lack of running water, etc., etc. But that, I think, is an extraordinarily rich recruiting ground for people who might do the dirty deed with the Shermans. But in order to insert them into that network, you'd need a Federal Bridge man-in-the-middle technology, such as that developed by McDonnell Detweiler for the Treaty 3 police. Over to you.
The thing that I'm looking at right now, David, is, are there any similarities between this Sicilian vampire? It's almost a crest, you know? We've got these wings on either side of Frank D'Angelo's head, and we've got these sort of serpent tails that look like Baphomet horns. And then as I look at the Treaty 3 police logo, it is also surrounded by wings here. We've got the pyramid. I don't know.
Well, the migration of symbols is very interesting. Have you ever heard of, is it the Triskelion? There's a movement, a sort of millennialist end of the world movement that suggests that eventually humanity will disappear into a three-legged monster.
Really?
And I think this kind of symbology suggests not necessarily a death wish, but something akin to the spirit of the people who set up these so-called death pools, right? And there's very obvious there was a death pool created by Serco shareholders and its investment banker N.M. Rothschild on 911, because they met on the 47th floor, as we know, of the North Tower. None of them, as far as I know, died. But let's say they were engaged or had been set up as a death pool where they could bet, perhaps thinking it was a simulation, on the time of death of high-value targets or the body count of a mass casualty event. Remember, Dr. Thomas Barnett said that this 911, speaking of 911, was the first live broadcast mass snuff film in human history.
Right.
There is, whether it's a death wish, there's a kind of fatalism that the world has to end sometime soon, but preferably, I suggest, to the benefit of what Rockefeller described as a world bankers and an intellectual elite. So the Federal Bridge, for me, has become a mechanism for delivering a state of affairs where wetware, which unfortunately describes you and me, Jason, as opposed to hardware and software, it's basically people with blood running through their veins, should be purged or eliminated, or depopulation, if you will. So the elite come through, and with technology like you're showing there with the schematic at the Federal Bridge, over on the right-hand side, you see 5 of the most powerful defense contractors in the world. EADS, that's the French company that behind Airbus, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Northrop Grumman, and the Boeing company. You put their assets together, and this I think serves to support Osama bin Laden's claim, and we talked about that a little earlier today. I think he made the claim and it was in a Time magazine article after 9/11, which I picked up in the dentist waiting room, and it said, allegedly quoting Osama bin Laden, "We have 3 independent networks to move Al-Qaeda or our assets around the world, and all the resources of the British and the Americans cannot stop us." Well, you're an American, I'm a Brit. I think we're probably as smart as most people, neither smarter or less smart than the average American or Brit. And it kind of stimulates me to think, well, what kind of network would be concealed from the good people of the United Kingdom and the United States? And the only thing that I can come up with is something like the Federal Bridge, which provides a secure method of communicating over insecure networks, right? So those big defense contractors would supply, the missiles and the guidance systems for pitch, roll, evade, and yaw. The Department of Justice, which is one of the key members of the Federal Bridge, could supply the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer community to oversee the movement away from heterosexual families and the traditional relationship between parents and their children. And then the 2 entities that had been removed in the 2001 Federal Bridge, which is, and I'm sure they're still connected, which is Wells Fargo and Citibank. As I pointed out, on 9/11, Wells Fargo was the master server of the leveraged lease on the Twin Towers, which was, I think, they ponied up $3.2 or $3.4 billion with a cartel of lenders to buy the 99-year mortgage on the Twin Towers from the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey. Larry Silverstein popped in $20 million, so he had some skin in the game. But essentially, Wells Fargo corruptly, I would suggest, this is the fraudulent part, the bridge of fraud, corruptly arranged with Lloyd's of London a double occurrence claim, when if both buildings came down in the same day, then Wells Fargo would file a claim as the leveraged lessor, I think that's the right term, for $6.4 billion, which is not bad for 6 weeks of exposure, right? Yeah. So incredibly sophisticated crime. Do I fully understand it? Not really. But what I don't understand is why the FBI or anyone else failed to investigate who was at the shareholders meeting of Serco on the 47th floor and who hosted it. And because all of that evidence has been destroyed, I would argue it's been spoliated, I'm entitled to an aggressive inference of guilt. And I think that meeting on the 47th floor was hosted by the man who spent 25 years with N.M. Rothschild, which is the investment bank for Queen Elizabeth II and President Donald Trump and Serco. And his name is Wilbur Ross, and he's now the Commerce Secretary. One of his predecessors, of course, ended up with a bullet in the back of her head in Yugoslavia. Over to you.
Right, of course. We're talking about Ron Brown being one of the predecessors to Wilbur Ross. But let me bring you back for a minute, David, to the murder of Barry and Honey Sherman, because it is now officially classified as a murder. It's no longer considered a murder-suicide. And I want to continue talking about our friend here, Mike Ritigliano, because as I began to look into his history, it's sort of amazing to me that he remains a law enforcement officer. This article going back to 2009 is talking about how he met Mafia Don. I mean, the guy basically has a long history of pretty serious corruption. He doesn't look like a very friendly fellow. And, you know, he's getting these cases overturned, but this particular charge relates to a 2002 meeting in Montreal that Ritigliano arranged and attended with members and associates of the Rizzuto traditional crime group. So there's a lot of reporting and a lot of evidence to indicate that that Mr. Ritigliano has some pretty long-standing connections into the criminal world. This is talking about the Montreal meeting. You know, Ritigliano was working out of the Alcohol and Gaming Commission, where he'd been since 1996. Now, Barry Sherman was involved in a number of very unusual investments, including a casino. He was trying to get a casino going at one time, which causes me to wonder if he had had any association with Mr. Ritigliano, given that he was involved with the Gaming Commission, and that we've got Frank D'Angelo owning this brewery that was owned by Sherman. And of course, we see Ritigliano going to court cases and making sure that Frank D'Angelo is getting acquitted of sexual harassment charges, after which he goes to a celebratory function put on by Frank D'Angelo. So we're beginning to sort of see a rough skeleton of some of these relationships here. It would seem like D'Angelo is this Hollywood guy. He's got record contracts. He's producing movies. Sometimes billionaires get involved in these types of productions, but I have to say, it seems very incongruent to me. I shouldn't say that sometimes billionaires get involved. I worked on a number of these movies that are, let's say, $1 million and below budgets, non-studio films where private investors are sought, and there's never been a billionaire involved, because people who are billionaires are generally very smart with their money, and being totally blunt, investing in motion picture production is a horrible investment. Independent films almost never make their money back, and I just find it difficult to imagine that someone who is so shrewd in business as to become a billionaire in the pharmaceutical industry and be able to, you know, manage all this litigation, et cetera. It seems incongruent to me that he'd be investing in movies like The Sicilian Vampire, which, according to Vanity Fair, is essentially a piece of crap. It's also very strange that all those big name actors would be involved, like James Caan and Paul Sorvino and Daryl Hannah. It's, you know, these are name actors that, as I said, again, in a film like this, the budget might be, you know, $1 million, it might be 100,000, who knows? But to get one actor like that would be a tremendous coup for a film like this. So it seems strange to me that all of them would be in this film. It seems like an indicator that this guy, Frank D'Angelo, is somehow connected. He doesn't seem to be a skilled enough filmmaker to really make a quality product in terms of the screenwriting, the cinematography, the editing, the directing. You know, all the reviews and even the short clips I've seen of these films display very amateurish characteristics, and all of this stuff defies the likelihood of billionaires investing, name actors getting involved. It's very strange.
Well, I think we need to run the clock back to look at the continuity of MO of organized crime. So we've talked a little bit about the Kray twins in London, and the Krays said, you know, the Beatles run the world of music, Carnaby Street runs the world of fashion, and we run London, that is the London Underground. Now, in 1969, the Kray twins were arrested and jailed for life. I think they'd been found out in a contract hit, but they were both, or certainly one of them, was a pedophile psychopath, right? A homosexual pedophile psychopath. And they were famous for organizing parties for senior politicians, and for all I know, the royal family, and various Hollywood stars. Now, when they went behind bars, they apparently set up an organization called Crayley Enterprises, which provided a protection service for, or bodyguards, for Hollywood stars and Arab sheikhs. And one of them boasted that we'd never lost one of our clients. Well, as an example, in 1988, Frank Sinatra, I believe, came to Wimbledon.
Yeah.
And the Krays, from behind bars, provided him with 19 bodyguards.
Right.
Now, I can guarantee you that when you're providing a Hollywood star with 19 bodyguards, those bodyguards are expected to provide extra judicial services, like finding sexual partners for the star. And of course, if you can set up an opportunity to, I don't know whether Frank Sinatra was, well, whatever he was, he could be set up with a sexual partner of an indeterminate age, not sure what sex it is, but the objective of the Kray twins would then be to get the images and the pictures and make sure that they had control of the Hollywood star, and equally with the Saudi prince. So, and the beauty of that is it's a prison-based protection racket. Well, someone taught, and I think that happened around the 1978 period when Field McConnell's sister Christine Marcy conceived a Mendenhall's baby. So in August of 1979, she produces the child that would appear to be related to or look very much like Nicholas Soames, right, who was Minister of Defense in the John Major government, 94 to 97. That was when, of course, Princess Di was, I believe, murdered. But interestingly, his brother, Rupert Soames, is the chief executive officer of Serco. Right? Now, Serco, I'm putting the clock back now, in 1983, one of the members of White's Club, which is the oldest gentleman's gambling club in the world, probably, it was founded in 1692, a guy called Tom Stacey, Stacey, a very learned traveler, book writer, etc. He created, I think it was maybe 1984, the Offenders Tag Association. And the Offenders Tag Association was premised on the idea that you would put an electronic ankle bracelet on a prisoner and give them limited degrees of freedom, but avoid incarcerating them. Now, this is very interesting because that feeds directly into this Jerome Lemelson patent of prisoner tracking, where you upgrade or downgrade privileges of the prisoner depending on the output from, quote, a expert system, artificial intelligence, or fuzzy logic algorithm. So I could imagine that people are programming the computers and the algorithms to determine what members of the population of the prison system in Canada and the United States could be usefully deployed on a long-range snuff film project. You know, it would be perhaps for certain kind of prisoners a privilege. Instead of wasting away in a jail, you know, with the same set of cellmates, you get a 48-hour kick to go and whack someone in Istanbul and come back to the prison, and you're back in the inventory of assets to be used for the next snuff film. So that level of corruption, of course, if it's true, it's absolutely permeated the Five Eyes countries because Serco is the #1 transporter of prisons around the world.
I mean, you bring up a lot of very interesting connections, David. To be fair, some of what we're saying right now is speculative, but the connections are extremely interesting. I want to go back for a second to the Cray brothers and this article in the Daily Mail that we've pointed out. Craig Murray doesn't like the Daily Mail. He says never trust the Daily Mail, but I do believe it's true that the Cray twins were involved in this, bodyguard business where they provided a bodyguard for Frank Sinatra. I don't know if they did anything beyond those bodyguard services, but I think we should point out that they've also connected the Crays to other Hollywood stars, including Judy Garland and Diana Dors. And now, David, I'm sure you recall Diana Dors was married to Richard Dawson, and she is pivotal in the death of Bob Crane mystery. She also was a central character in the focus of a lot of the research that I was doing with, again, Quinn Michaels. I don't know why this damn share selection keeps showing up when I'm trying to highlight Diana Dors. But Diana Dors was famous for having these underground Hollywood sex parties, and certainly she was connected to what Quinn has defined as the red net. So I wonder, is this guy, Frank D'Angelo, connected to the underworld in a way that makes him very popular with Hollywood stars, to the extent that they perhaps owe him favors that might cause them to appear in a crap film that they otherwise would never dream of appearing in? I don't know, but it's interesting.
Well, I think it's more likely that he has information about them and periodically calls in a favor or threatens to expose something they've done to another human being which might put them on death row.
I mean, again, we can speculate, but it's hard to say. It's just interesting to draw these connections and to to observe these links between what would appear to be the underworld, the entertainment world, and the law enforcement world. They all seem to be connected through, Frank D'Angelo and Mike Ritigliano. Now, what exactly is it that ties Mike Ritigliano to the death investigation of the Shermans?
Well, I think we have to back up a bit. You see, connections are at this level. They're very complex, right? And they may be through the use of shared technology, shared dollars, or shared
influence,
sexual victims, right? So, for example, if we take little Barack Hussein Obama at 7 years old being groomed, if that's the right word, by a cross-dressing male prostitute called Turdy. At 7 years old, it's quite possible, apparently she was putting lipstick on him. It's very likely she was pimping him around Jakarta. No fault of his own. He matures in a kind of hybrid land where childhood is lost and he's skilled at the art of servicing adults, and ultimately becomes a very powerful tool in a blackmail network out of Chicago, right? We have the Down Low Club in Chicago, remember?
Yes.
Where apparently unattractive or ugly lesbian women, not necessarily, I believe, physically unattractive, but spiritually unattractive. Basically, no one likes them. They can't find a mate, a heterosexual mate. So my understanding of the Down Low Club is they would be paired off with a young homosexual male, and their CVs rewritten and some children adopted, so that they can look like they're a regular couple. And I think the word for that is a beard. You get yourself a beard, and you basically, maybe you can be groomed for the White House. But really, that's a kind of dressing room Hollywood ambition. You can take someone who's extremely unlikely ever to get into the White House. You put together the scenario with script writers and et cetera, they end up in the White House, and then they become captive Manchurian candidates that you can basically use them to manipulate the country. Now, was Donald Trump a target for that kind of operation? Well, he certainly lived in that world, I think, right? The question from British intelligence point of view is, are they vulnerable to blackmail? And most of these characters, you look at Bill Clinton, kicked out of Oxford in 1968 for rape and dealing in drugs. He goes to Moscow and cozies up with the KGB, presumably tells the KGB how to brief John Songbird McCain in the Hanoi Hilton, and then proceeds to basically wreak havoc on the justice system in the United States. So direct connections I don't think we will find, and that brings me back to this how shall I put it, heuristic technique of justice. Instead of trying to prove murder one, where you're looking for beyond reasonable doubt from a jury that's probably terrified and out of its depth because the thing is so complex, back up a bit, do the OJ type thing. Has anyone died as a result of the negligent, reckless, willful, or fraudulent use of a patented device, such as the various devices on the Federal Bridge? And then you get discovery, you go after them with a class action suit. And the intriguing thing here with that approach, Jason, is if you find evidence of spoliation, you are entitled, we the people, the American people, the relatives of the Shermans, are entitled to what is known as an aggressive inference of guilt. If they've taken away evidence or planted evidence, like planting evidence of a murder-suicide, when obviously it wasn't, right? You can unravel that through the civil courts. You don't need to go into the criminal courts. Find out who had the custody of the root keys of the Federal Bridge amongst the Treaty 3 police or whatever it is. Ultimately determine if there is a case for wrongful death, bring a lawsuit for damages, right? Mm-hmm. And then let the chips where they may. And if subsequently you find a motive for murder one, well, lock them up, and in the case of the United States, put them on death row.
You know, David, along the lines of spoliation of evidence, I wonder if that testimony that we heard from the Toronto police detective, he's saying they're not, you know, they're treating it as a suicide. They're not looking for any particular person of interest. Perhaps that is some indirect form of spoliation of evidence by directing the police away from the investigation.
Correct.
Yeah.
So someone gave him, or someone told him, to go in front of the media because the preliminary investigation, I don't know whether he was actually at the crime scene,
He was,
but he
it
was
appears.
told to present the case to the media, and probably with something like that, you don't mess around. You want to be very careful about what your spokesperson says to the media.
Yes.
And he said, or he was told to say, we're not looking for anyone. There was no sign of a break-in. And I don't know whether he explicitly said it was a murder-suicide, or the inference was that it was a murder-suicide. That's a classic example for me of spoliation of evidence. Now, if that spoliation of evidence was a result of the use of patented hacking devices like Entrust devices into the Federal Bridge, then you can nail these scumbags.
Right. Well, David, I want to play this video just one more time. I believe I've got what we need here to make it work for you to hear it. Let me just make sure that that's set correctly. Let's just play it again really quickly, because I think this is a pretty important video. Oh, wait a second. I've got to make sure we've got everything. So many things that I'm doing to prevent the audio from playing when we don't want it to. So let's see if we can get it to work here.
I can say that at this point in the investigation, though it is very early, we are not currently seeking or looking for an outstanding suspect.
Not working.
After autopsies were
for me, anyway.
performed on
All right. Well, we'll have to worry about that after the show. There's quite a lot more for us to investigate here, David, but this is certainly a fascinating case with lots of very, very strange connections. We've been going for a little over an hour and 15 minutes. I think this is something we're going to have to dig into further and perhaps do some more episodes about. Before we wrap it up for tonight, I do want to remind everyone that David and I are doing a regular show on Fridays. It's usually happening at 1 p.m. Eastern, but the time is sometimes a bit flexible. You can always catch it on patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards, or of course patreon.com/crowdsource the truth. I do want to encourage viewers of Crowdsource the Truth to go to patreon.com/reverse-CSI storyboards and sponsor David. He's doing a lot of posts on there. David is a prolific writer. Of course, he's done a lot of work for many, many years with Able Danger, and he's using Patreon now as his primary method of posting. So I hope that people will go over there. In addition to all the videos that we do together, David's writing can be found there. David, is there anything you want to leave us with tonight before we wrap it up? And certainly I think we should plan another episode about the strange death of Barry and Honey Sherman.
No, I think, but I'd like to send a message directly or indirectly to the members of the Sherman family that there is hope, that there are investigators like you and I who are on the trail of the truth. And I think when and if we arrive at that truth, it's actually going to shake the justice system in Canada to its very foundations. Over to you.
Absolutely, David. Thank you for joining me, and I want to thank all of our generous Patreon sponsors and all of our viewers. I will be back tomorrow at 3 with another episode of Sunday with Charles. It's very interesting to note, David, this murder of the Shermans crosses over into Charles Ortel's research and investigation. So I'm always fascinated when two different guests on Crowdsource the Truth sort of cross paths, because both you and Charles are brilliant in your own right, and you've got got very different investigative styles, and you're investigating very different matters. So when they cross over, I think that's where there's a real opportunity for some magic to happen in terms of discovering things that we otherwise would not. So I really want to thank you for joining me tonight, and I'll see everybody tomorrow at 3. Thanks for watching.
Thank you, Jason. Bye for now.